right, with adding and subtracting radicals advanced level, we're going to again use that idea of an I. So, like we said before, when we were just simplifying radicals, if we have a negative underneath an even root, we will end up with an I or an imaginary number. So, as we're looking at this, again, our very first step before we can do anything is we need to make sure that we break down each of our terms. So as we look at negative 8, this would be negative 1 times 8. And again, that's square root of negative 1 times square root of 8. So we're going to break down the 8 to be 2 times 4, and 4 to break down to be 2 times 2. And again, the idea, because there's nothing sitting on the shelf, there's really a 2. The number that's out in front is going to come straight down. So there's a 3. We have a pair of 2's. So the 2 is going to come out. And then we have this 2 that's sitting there, as well as, again, this idea of the square root of a negative 1 being an I. So we need to take into consideration both of those. So this will be an I, and we have a root 2 left over. We're then going to move on to the second value, which is our 18. So again, we could do 2 times 9. We can do 3 times 6. Doesn't really matter. All breaks down to be the same prime factors. So again, there's nothing on the shelf, so there's no index there, so there's really a 2. And as we're looking for pairs, we have a pair of 3's. So the 3 is going to come out. Oops, there's a plus sign there. A 3 is going to come out, and there's a 2 left over, so it's going to stay underneath the radical. And then our last little one, our negative 50. Again, we're going to do square root of negative 1, square root of 50. Again, that square root of negative 1 is always our I. And then we're going to break down the 50. So 50 is going to be 5 times 10, or 2 and 25. And then our 10 is going to break down to be 2 times 5. So again, as we're looking, noticing that we have a minus 2 sitting out in front, so that's going to come straight down. So that comes straight down. And then as we're looking for our pair, we have a pair of 5's. So that's going to come out. We have this idea of an I. So that's going to come out. And then we have a 2 left over. So just like we had before, this little I needs to come out on the outside of the radical. So hopefully you're noticing that it's on the outside. Okay, it's on the outside of the radical. And now we're going to simplify. So as we're looking at our first term, we've got 3 times 2 times I, which would be 6I, root 2. Middle term just is going to stay the same as 3 root 2. And then our last term, we've got a negative 2 times 5, which is negative 10 I root 2. Now, as we're looking at these terms, I'm hoping that you're noticing that they all have a radical 2, which, remember, when we added and subtracted, we found that if our value under the radical was the same, we could just combine the numbers in front. That is still true, except for the fact that we also have an issue of an imaginary number. So when we're looking at complex numbers, which means we have a real part and an imaginary part, we can't add real numbers and imaginary numbers together. So this is a real number, and these are both imaginary. So imaginary at the end and imaginary in the front. So when we have real and imaginary, real can be added to real and imaginary can be added to imaginary, but not together. So that means we're going to write the real part first, because usually what happens when we write a complex number is we have the real part comes in front and that imaginary part comes in the back. So in this case, as we're looking and we're going to rewrite this problem, we want to do the same thing. We want the real part to come first. So this is going to be 3 root 2. And then the second part is we can combine these imaginary numbers. So we've got 6 minus 10, which is negative 4. That makes the imaginary part root 2. So this would be my final answer. Now, sometimes you're going to see, especially on the computer, they like to put an I at the end. So another way for you to see this would be 3 root 2 minus 4 root 2 with the I on the outside of the radical. I usually like to write it in front of the radical so that, especially when you're putting it in the computer, sometimes you forget that you need to arrow over to get the radical to end. And so I usually like to put it in front.